The rain had been coming down in sheets for hours, the sort of cold, relentless drizzle that makes the road look like a stretch of black glass. My headlights barely cut through it, the wipers working overtime to keep the windshield clear. The kind of night where you just want to keep driving, no matter how far, just to get out of it. I was on one of those desolate stretches of road, the kind where the signs are few and the lights are even fewer. A few miles back, I'd passed an old pub and a small village that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The night had a quiet, oppressive feel to it, the sort of quiet that makes you uneasy, like something is just waiting to happen. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't tired either, not really, but the longer I drove, the more I felt the weight of the road pressing down on me. I'd already passed two cars heading the opposite way, both with their headlights off, which was odd, but I hadn't thought much of it. You get used to odd things on long drives. That's when I saw him. A figure standing at the side of the road, his thumb out, drenched to the bone, just standing there, motionless. At first, I was going to pass him by. The road was empty enough. I didn't need to pick up a hitchhiker, especially not in weather like this. But something made me stop. Something in the way he just stood there, waiting, as if he didn't expect to be picked up, but had been standing there for hours, maybe days. I rolled down the window just enough to speak to him, though I was half tempted not to. He didn't say much when he climbed in. Just a quick nod, a quiet thank you, and that was it. He looked exhausted, his hair matted to his forehead, eyes hollow. His coat was soaked through, and his shoes, worn down and full of holes, made squelching sounds as he shifted in the seat. I wasn't much of a talker, and he didn't seem to be either, so we just drove in silence. After a while, I noticed he kept his gaze fixed out the window. His hands were folded in his lap, and he didn't move much. I glanced at him now and then, catching glimpses of his face, but he seemed like the sort who wouldn't say anything unless he absolutely had to. That suited me fine. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, and the rain wasn't helping either. The first crack in his story came when I asked him where he was headed. He told me he was on his way to a small town about 50 miles away, but when I asked which direction, he hesitated. The hesitation lasted just a little too long before he said straight ahead, and then fell silent again. It didn't sit right with me. There was something about his answer that didn't add up, but I couldn't put my finger on it. People are often vague when they're hitching a ride. I told myself maybe he just didn't want to talk. But the more I watched him, the more things didn't make sense. His hands were too clean, considering how wet and filthy the rest of him was. His coat was fine, no tears, no signs of having been out there for hours. And his eyes, there was something in them. They weren't just tired, they were distant, like he was somewhere else entirely, lost in thought, or maybe trying to hide something. We reached a small petrol station about half an hour later, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much, just a few pumps and a small kiosk, the kind that's open even in the middle of the night. The rain hadn't let up, and the lights at the station cast a strange yellow glow in the wet darkness. I pulled up to the pumps, but before I could open the door to get out and stretch my legs, I heard the unmistakable sound of the locks clicking into place. I looked over at the hitchhiker. He was sitting perfectly still, staring ahead, not moving a muscle. "Let me out," I said, more out of instinct than any real belief that he'd listen. But he didn't even flinch. He didn't look at me. His eyes were still fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even heard me. I tried the door handle. Locked. I reached for the other one, panicking now. Locked. I looked back at him, my heart starting to race. I could feel the tension building in my chest, like something was wrong. His silence had turned from strange to suffocating. The way he sat there, not even acknowledging my movements. It was like he wasn't even human. I started to shout, pounding on the window. No response. The rain kept falling, a constant roar against the car. I tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just messing with me. Maybe he thought it was funny. But something told me that wasn't the case. The weight of the situation pressed down on me harder with each passing second. The station seemed emptier now, quieter, like it was swallowing sound. The only thing I could hear was the rain. I leaned back, my hands shaking, trying to think. There was no one around, no other cars, no movement from the station, just the rain, just him. I had to do something. But the more I looked at him, the more I realized he wasn't just a passenger. He was the one in control now. Then slowly, without looking at me, he reached for the door handle on his side and opened it. The rain hit him in a rush, but he didn't seem to care. He stepped out of the car and closed the door behind him, all without a word. I sat there, frozen, my hand still on the door handle, my chest tight with fear. and the rain still pouring down. I didn't know whether to drive off or stay, and then I saw just before he disappeared into the darkness, the faint glint of something metal in his hand. I pulled into the motel's parking lot just after midnight. The neon sign flickered weakly above the entrance, casting a dull, sickly glow over everything. The road had been long and I was tired, just wanted to sleep, get some rest before the drive tomorrow. The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones where you can't tell if it's the exhaustion or something else that's making your eyes feel so heavy. The place looked like one of those cheap roadside motels you always pass, with peeling paint and a clunky air conditioner sticking out of a window. It wasn't much, but it would do. I figured the price would be low enough that I wouldn't mind sleeping in a room that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. The lobby was small, dark, and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes. The guy behind the desk was grinning at me as I walked in. He had a weird smile, too wide, like it was stuck there, permanently frozen. His hair was too neat, like he'd combed it a dozen times just before I arrived. "Late night," he said, without me saying a word. His voice was a little too cheerful, too eager, like he was happy to see me, which didn't make sense. People don't act like that when they've been sitting in a quiet lobby all night alone. "Just need a room," I said, rubbing my eyes. I was half asleep already. He handed me a key, the kind with a plastic tag, and told me to head to room 12. I didn't think much of it. He made some small talk about the weather, then wished me a good night, still smiling. It was too much, too forced. Something about it unsettled me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I dragged my suitcase down the corridor, past a few other doors. Some of the rooms were dark, but there were a couple of lights on. Through the thin walls I could hear muffled sounds, television maybe, or someone moving around. No voices, just static and the hum of an air conditioner that seemed a little too loud. Room 12 was at the end of the hall. The door was already cracked open. I pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside. The room was a throwback to the 80s, with faded wallpaper and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. The carpet was worn down in spots, but it was clean enough. The air smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with something metallic. I didn't care, I just needed to lie down. I dragged my suitcase to the bed, pulled back the sheets, and froze. There were bloodstains, not big ones, but enough to make my stomach lurch. The sheets were crisp white, so the stains stood out like a bruise. I moved quickly, stuffing the blanket back into place and stepping away from the bed. My heart started to beat faster, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was old, or maybe the stains weren't what I thought. But there was no denying it. Something felt wrong. I turned to the dresser, thinking maybe I could just ignore it, sleep on top of the covers. The dresser drawers were empty, just like the closet, but as I turned towards the bed again, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There was a small, dark hole in the corner of the smoke detector, a tiny pinprick of a hole like it had been drilled through. The light above flickered, casting a strange shadow across the ceiling. My blood ran cold. It was a camera. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. I walked to the door, my mind racing, but before I reached it, I heard something. A noise. The floorboards in the hall creaked. I froze, staring at the door. My hand was on the handle, but I couldn't make myself open it. I had the feeling, the awful certainty that someone was out there watching. There was another noise. This one was quieter, almost imperceptible, like someone breathing just on the other side of the door. I stepped back from it, trying not to make a sound. My breath was too loud. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I thought about calling the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't know what to say. What would I tell them? That I had found bloodstains in a motel room and a camera in the ceiling? No, I couldn't do that. It would sound insane. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then I heard the front desk bell chime, followed by footsteps down the hall. The clerk, the same weird, too friendly guy. I didn't dare move. Not yet. I waited, hoping he'd go away, that I could sneak out unnoticed. But when the door to the hallway finally creaked open, I knew I was trapped. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. I moved into the old building on Winford Street last November, a place that had seen better days. It was one of those buildings where the floors creak beneath your feet and the walls are thin enough that you can hear people's conversations through them. But the rent was cheap, and frankly, I wasn't in a position to be picky. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The landlady, Mrs. Collins, was a quiet woman, a bit of a recluse, but I never had much to do with her. I kept to myself, and she, I assumed, did the same. The neighbours weren't much better. No one seemed to have any interest in getting to know anyone else. It was that kind of place. But there was one thing that started bothering me after a few weeks. The noises. They started faintly around the same time every night, just after midnight. At first I thought it was the building settling. You know how old places do that, creak and groan with every change in temperature. But then the noises started getting more distinct. Faint thuds. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. A muffled thump, like a door slamming, followed by something scraping, like nails on wood. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I told myself it was just the old plumbing, or maybe the guy in the flat next door was just a bit of a night owl, maybe a bit too drunk, having a rough night. But the more it went on, the more unsettling it became. A few nights later, the sounds were different. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear what sounded like someone crying. Quiet at first, just a soft, desperate sobbing, like someone was trying to stay quiet but couldn't help it. I lay there in bed, wide awake, straining to listen. My heart started beating faster. I've never been one for overthinking, but in that moment I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Collins in the hallway. I casually asked her if there was anyone living in the flat next door. She seemed a little too quick to respond. "No, no one's there," she said almost too cheerfully. "That flat's been empty for months." I raised an eyebrow. I could have sworn I'd heard voices, and those noises didn't sound like anything I'd associate with an empty flat. But I didn't press her. I figured it was none of my business. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. I started hearing scraping, like furniture being dragged across the floor, or something tapping against the wall, and then one night it came. A loud, frantic banging. It was so loud it shook the walls, and I jumped out of bed, heart racing. It was followed by desperate thumping, as if someone was pounding on the door, but not in the normal way. It was erratic, wild, someone trying to escape. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to do something. I went down to the landlord's office the next day, feeling uneasy. Mrs. Collins was behind the counter flipping through papers. I asked her again about the unit next door. "No, still no one there," she said, not meeting my eyes. Her tone was stiff, too quick. I didn't believe her. There was no way that banging, those cries, could come from an empty flat. I told myself that I had to check it out myself. That night, after Mrs. Collins had gone home, I waited until the building was quiet. The hallway was dark and cold, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones. I made my way next door, heart pounding in my chest. I tried the door handle, locked of course, but the door was old, the kind that could be forced with a little effort. I didn't even hesitate. The moment the door creaked open, the smell hit me. It was awful, like something rotting. I held my breath and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, but I could see well enough by the light spilling in from the hallway. The place was a mess. Dirty dishes stacked in the kitchen, a few bits of furniture scattered about, a blanket haphazardly thrown across the sofa, but there was something more, something sinister in the air. And then I heard it again, that sound, the scraping. It came from the bedroom, the door ajar. My legs felt like lead as I approached. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. When I opened the door, I stopped dead in my tracks. There in the middle of the room was a man. He was on the floor, covered in sweat and grime, his hands bound tightly behind him with rope, a gag stuffed in his mouth, muffling his cries. His eyes were wide, frantic, pleading. I couldn't move. My mind raced. I tried to step forward, but something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. The closet door was slightly open. It was then that I saw her. Mrs. Collins. She was standing in the corner of the room, silent and still, watching me. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes... There was something dark there, something dangerous. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't have time to think. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the flat, but I bolted down the stairs, through the hall, and out the door. I don't know what happened to the man in there, and I don't think I want to. I never saw Mrs. Collins again, and when I went back to check the flat the next day, it was empty, just like she'd said. The plan was simple enough. Take a shortcut through the woods and shave a couple of hours off the hike. We were at the edge of the national park, the sun still high, with enough light to find our way back to the car before dark. My friend, Matt, had suggested the route. He'd hiked these parts a few times before and knew the area like the back of his hand. I'd been on plenty of walks with him, and we'd never gotten lost. At least that was until we decided to take the shortcut. It started innocently enough. The path, though not marked on any map we had, seemed like it was well trodden. It was narrow but clear enough. The underbrush thinned where people had walked before. The sort of place where, if you were in a rush, you'd look at the main trail and think, "I'll take the quicker way." We figured it'd loop us around to the main route in half the time. But as we pushed further, the trail began to fade. First there were fewer signs of footprints, then the ground became more uneven, covered in dead leaves and tangled roots. Matt grumbled about the route being more overgrown than he remembered, but shrugged it off. I followed behind, a little uneasy, but not enough to say anything. The forest, though dense, wasn't exactly dark. We had plenty of daylight left. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes. It was a strange thing to admit to myself later, but something about that place just didn't feel right. When our phone signals started dropping, that's when I began to feel the knot tightening in my stomach. We'd been following this trail for an hour by then, and my phone was showing no signal at all. Matt checked his face tightening as he muttered under his breath. "Must be some dead zone around here," he said, but I could tell he was starting to worry too. We kept walking. The trail had practically disappeared now, swallowed by the trees and the thick undergrowth. The only sign we were still on a path at all were occasional markers scratched into tree trunks, just a slash or two, faint enough to be easy to miss. We were probably walking in circles, but it was hard to say. It was then that we saw it, a cabin. Not a big one, but solid, sitting in a small clearing, isolated from the rest of the forest. I hadn't expected to see anything like it in these parts. There were no roads or signs of civilization nearby. The cabin looked abandoned, though. Wooden walls weathered, roof sagging, a broken window on one side. The door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly with the wind. We didn't want to go in. But the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the thought of being out there, lost in the woods with night falling, seemed worse than whatever might be inside the cabin. We pushed the door open, the wood groaning as it gave way. A chill went down my spine as I stepped inside. It was dark in there, the light from outside barely reaching through the gaps in the wooden planks. It smelled of mildew and dust, but it didn't seem completely abandoned. The place was filled with the usual remnants of someone living there, furniture draped in sheets, old cans of food piled up in the corner. But there were other things that didn't belong. Stacks of old newspapers, some crumpled, some folded neatly, all with disturbing headlines. I walked further in and then I saw the maps. They were pinned to the wall, not the usual tourist maps you'd expect in a cabin like this, but detailed topographical ones, with areas marked in red, trails, hunting grounds, and something that made my skin crawl, red marks on places deep in the forest. I tried to ignore the feeling rising in my gut as I turned away, but then I saw the tools. A set of knives neatly arranged on a workbench, all sharpened to a frightening gleam, the kind of knives that didn't belong to any ordinary camper or hiker. There were traps too, tucked into corners, their metal teeth catching the dim light. And then I heard it, a faint creak, not from the floor beneath me, but from the back of the cabin, like the door to a room was slowly opening. My heart stopped. I glanced at Matt, who was staring at the wall with wide eyes. He was already backing up, inching toward the door. I didn't want to look, but I had to. There on the table was a phone, a cracked one, but still functioning. I picked it up, hesitated, then unlocked it. There was nothing on the home screen, but when I opened the photos, my breath caught. Pictures of the forest, the cabin too. But there were other photos, close-ups of faces, people. Some of them I recognized, other hikers I'd seen on the trail not too far from where we'd started. There were shots of them sitting in their tents, unaware, walking along the path. The images made my blood run cold. I shoved the phone into my pocket, and that's when we heard it again. A louder creak, then the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through leaves, slow but deliberate, just outside the cabin. My throat tightened. Matt was already at the door, yanking it open, his eyes wide with panic. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We bolted, running through the woods, the trees blurring around us. I could hear Matt ahead of me gasping for breath. We didn't stop, not even when we heard the twigs snapping behind us, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following close. The further we went, the faster the noise seemed to get. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail, gasping for air, eyes wild. But when we turned around, there was no one there. I never saw the cabin again. Neither did Matt. But the memory of it lingers always, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever we found there wasn't just a hunting cabin. It was a place where things, people went missing, and whoever owned it was still out there. I didn't plan on spending more than an hour there, maybe two. I wasn't expecting much either. A few shots of peeling paint, rusted metal, maybe a cool image or two for the blog. That's all it was supposed to be. Just another abandoned factory. The place had been on my list for months. A sprawling old textile mill on the outskirts of town, long since shut down and forgotten. I had seen it from the road many times, the large windows boarded up and the building sagging like a tired old man. But there was something about it, the stillness, the silence, that made it intriguing. So one cold Saturday afternoon, I made my way there with my camera bag and a sense of excitement that comes with stepping into places others shy away from. I had broken in through a side door, the lock rusted and barely hanging on. The creaking metal sent a shiver up my spine, but I shrugged it off. This was what I did: explore the forgotten places, take pictures, and share the stories no one else wanted to tell. The kind of places that made you feel like the world had forgotten they even existed. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of old machinery and mildew clung to everything. The sunlight barely filtered through the grimy windows, casting a sickly light across the abandoned factory floor. Piles of broken equipment, rotting wood, and rusted steel were scattered around like the remnants of something long past its prime. I pulled out my camera and started snapping photos of the cracks in the walls, the peeling paint, the strange shadows that seemed to move in the corners. But then I saw the wrappers. They were on the ground, half hidden beneath an overturned box. Empty food wrappers, the kind you'd find at any corner shop. Crisp packets, chocolate bars, and fast food containers. Fresh, too fresh. I frowned and bent down to get a closer look. There were crumbs scattered around, and the smell of something faintly sweet, like sugar, lingered in the air. The wrapper wasn't even old. I could tell because it still had a crispness to it, the edges not yet curling with age. It didn't make sense. I'd checked the place before I came in, no signs of anyone, but now someone had been here recently. I kept moving, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The factory was vast, and the echo of my footsteps made everything seem distant, disconnected. But the feeling lingered, growing stronger as I walked deeper into the building. Then I found the phone. It was lying on a table in a small, half-hidden office, just out of place among the dust and cobwebs. It was cracked, the screen shattered, but it still buzzed faintly as though it had just received a message. I couldn't resist. I picked it up, thinking it might be useful. Maybe there'd be a clue as to who had been here. The photos were what stopped me. The gallery wasn't full, but what was there made my blood run cold. Grainy, blurry shots of the factory, the same things I'd seen. Old machinery, empty rooms, rusted doors. But then there were others. Closer, more personal. There were pictures of me taken from different angles, blurry like the person had been hiding. One photo showed me entering through the side door. Another showed me near the food wrappers, and in one I was standing at the window, looking out, completely unaware. I felt a cold lump in my throat. My heart started pounding as I scrolled through more pictures, each one more unsettling than the last. The person had been close, closer than I'd ever imagined. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The door slammed shut with a bang that made me jump out of my skin. I froze, holding the phone, not sure what to do. I turned towards the door, but it was already locked. I ran to the nearest window and tried to open it. No luck. It was stuck tight, the wood swollen from years of neglect. I hammered on the glass, but no sound came through. The factory was isolated. There was no one to hear me. I tried the door again, twisting the handle, pulling at the lock, but it didn't budge. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking around the factory, echoing off the walls. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Someone was moving through the building, and they were making sure I knew it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I backed away from the door and moved deeper into the factory. My heart racing. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to move. The phone was still in my hand, and for a split second I considered calling the police. But what would I say? "Hello, I'm locked inside an abandoned factory, and I think someone's here with me." They'd never believe me. I rounded a corner and nearly tripped over a pile of metal pipes. The factory seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of corridors and rooms that all looked the same. The footsteps were closer now, muffled by the walls. Whoever was following me was getting closer, moving at a pace that made my skin crawl. I could feel them getting nearer, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I couldn't hear them breathing. I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own heart hammering in my chest. I ran again, not knowing where I was going, but I had to get away. The doors, the windows, none of it would open. I was trapped. Somewhere far behind me I heard a door creak open, then silence. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran for. It felt like hours, but maybe it was only minutes. I don't know when I reached the back of the factory, but I knew I was too far in now. There was nowhere left to run. The footsteps stopped. I stopped too, my breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. But there was nothing. Not a sound. Not a whisper. I don't know when the door closed behind me. I don't know how long I've been standing here. All I know is I can't get out, and I'm not alone anymore. And whoever is here with me doesn't want me to leave. The cabin looked as though it had been carved straight out of the mountainside. Remote and silent, it was everything we'd hoped for when we booked it. Far from civilization, a proper getaway. The drive up had been rough, the winding roads narrowing into tracks and the forest closing in like it wanted to swallow the car whole. When we finally arrived, we were relieved to see the place standing there in the clearing, its roof dusted with pine needles and smoke curling faintly from the chimney. It was Claire who noticed the first odd thing when we unlocked the door. The smell, not bad exactly, but lived in, warm and faintly musty like someone had only just left. Inside, the living room was sparse. A couple of sagging armchairs, a stone fireplace with logs stacked neatly in the grate, and an old coffee table. But it was the small details that unsettled me. There was a mug sitting on the table, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom, and a half-burnt cigarette stubbed out in the ashtray. In the kitchen, the sink was full of dirty dishes, and the bins smelled faintly of rotting fruit. Upstairs, one of the beds was unmade, the pillow dented where a head had rested. We chalked it up to the owners forgetting to clean after the last guests. It was annoying, but we didn't want to overthink it. We threw our bags in the bedrooms, opened a few beers, and tried to settle in. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, we'd almost forgotten about the strange state of the place. Almost. The first noise came just as we were finishing dinner. It was faint, like the shuffle of footsteps outside, and we all froze. Claire looked at me, her eyes wide, but we laughed it off, telling ourselves it was the wind in the trees or maybe an animal rooting around in the undergrowth. Still, I found myself glancing at the windows more often, the dark panes giving nothing back but our own reflections. Later, when I stepped outside to grab more beers from the car, I noticed something was wrong. The rear left tire was flat, the rubber split clean through. I crouched down, running my fingers over the gash, and my stomach dropped. This wasn't the work of a rock or a stray nail. It had been deliberate, the cut precise. I didn't say anything when I went back inside, but my hands were shaking. By midnight, the wind had picked up, making the trees groan and sway. The cabin creaked with it, every noise amplified in the stillness. At some point, we all ended up in the living room, sitting too close together, trying to act like everything was fine. The fire was dying down, and the shadows it threw against the walls flickered and danced, growing longer with each passing hour. That's when we heard it again. A soft thud, followed by another. This time it wasn't outside. It was upstairs. No one moved. I felt paralyzed, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the dark staircase. The thudding came again, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth just above our heads. I don't know how long we sat there, listening. The sound stopped eventually, but the silence that followed was worse. It was thick and suffocating, pressing down on us from all sides. We didn't dare go upstairs. Instead, we sat there until the fire burned itself out, the cold creeping in through the gaps in the old wooden walls. When the sun rose, we finally worked up the courage to look. The upstairs hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms all closed, just as we'd left them. But when I opened mine, I felt my stomach drop. My bag, which I'd left on the floor by the bed, was now on the chair by the window, the zip half open. In the corner of the room where the carpet met the skirting board was a muddy footprint. We left that morning, abandoning the cabin and the slashed tire. None of us spoke on the long walk back to the nearest road. Whatever we'd heard, or whoever, it hadn't been the wind, and I'm certain now that when we arrived at that cabin, we weren't alone. The storm had been howling for hours, rattling the windows and piling snow against the front door. The power had gone out not long after dark, and we were huddled in the living room, wrapped in blankets and lit by the flickering glow of the fireplace. It was the kind of night where you could feel the world closing in, everything beyond the walls swallowed up by the blizzard. The knocking came just after 10, sharp and frantic, cutting through the roar of the wind. My stomach tightened. No one should have been out in weather like this. I glanced at Mum and Dad, and they exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. Dad stood first, his face grim, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, the cold slammed into the house, carrying with it a man. He was tall and thin, his coat crusted with snow and his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked desperate, his eyes darting past Dad and into the warm light of the living room. He was saying something. I couldn't hear it over the storm, but I caught enough. His car had broken down a few miles back, and he needed shelter. Dad hesitated, but only for a moment. You couldn't leave someone out in weather like that, no matter who they were. He stepped aside, and the man stumbled in, shaking snow onto the rug. Mum handed him a blanket and a mug of tea, and he settled into the armchair nearest the fire. His shivering so violent it made the logs crackle louder. At first he seemed harmless, grateful. He told us his name, though I've forgotten it now, and said he'd been on his way to visit family. His car had skidded off the road into a ditch, and he'd walked for what felt like hours before seeing the faint glow of our house through the trees. He stayed close to the fire, rubbing his hands and staring into the flames like he was trying to warm himself from the inside out. I couldn't blame him for that, but as the hours dragged on, something about him started to feel off. It was little things at first, the way he avoided looking directly at any of us, the way his eyes flicked around the room, lingering just a second too long on the bookshelf, the photos on the mantel, the doorway leading to the kitchen. He asked odd questions, how far we were from the nearest town, if we often had visitors, whether we kept any pets. Mum answered politely, but I could see her hands twisting in her lap. Dad offered to call for help once the storm let up and the phone lines came back, but the man waved him off, saying he'd be fine come morning. He never mentioned the car again. Didn't ask if we could tow it or if he could borrow a phone. It struck me as strange, but I didn't say anything. By midnight, the fire was dying down and the house had grown colder. Mum suggested we all turn in for the night, but the man didn't budge from the chair. His face had changed, no longer desperate, but blank, almost calculating. His hands, which had been trembling when he arrived, were steady now, resting on his knees as though he were waiting for something. I couldn't sleep. The storm was still raging, but it wasn't the wind that kept me awake. I lay in bed listening for any sound from downstairs, my heart thudding too loud in my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust rattling the windows made my pulse jump. Around 2, I heard footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate, not heading towards the bathroom or the kitchen, but towards the stairs, towards my room. I sat up, holding my breath, and the footsteps stopped, just outside my door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The handle rattled, just slightly, and then nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading back down the hall. In the morning, he was gone. His coat was missing from the peg by the door, and the blanket we'd given him was folded neatly on the chair. Outside, the storm had calmed, but the snow was piled high against the house. There were no footprints leading away from the door. When Dad went to check the shed, he found the lock broken and the petrol can missing. The car in the driveway had been siphoned dry. We never saw him or the car he'd claimed to have again, I was 12 years old the summer Dad took me camping. I didn't want to go, not really, but it wasn't like I could say that. Things at home weren't great, hadn't been for months since Mum passed. Dad was trying, I could see that. His smiles didn't reach his eyes anymore, but he kept putting them on like a mask. The trip was his idea, a way to reconnect, he said, though I think we both knew he was just trying to fill the silence that had swallowed up the house. We went to the New Forest, somewhere neither of us had been before. The campsite was nothing fancy, just a flat bit of ground near a small stream, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. At home there was always something, a telly buzzing, cars outside, people shouting down the street. Out there it was just the wind and the occasional rustle of something in the undergrowth. We spent the day setting up the tent, cooking over a little gas stove, and pretending we weren't uncomfortable in each other's company. By the time night fell, the fire was crackling, and Dad seemed more like his old self. He even laughed at one of my dumb jokes, and for a moment it felt almost normal. But then I saw him. It was just a flash at first, a pale shape moving between the trees on the edge of the clearing. I thought it was my imagination, or maybe an animal, a deer or something, but when I glanced again, he was still there, half hidden in the shadows, a man, just standing there watching us. I froze, unsure what to do. Dad noticed me staring and followed my gaze. He stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans, and squinted into the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, but it was enough to make out the man's outline. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like he was waiting for something. Dad told me to stay put. He grabbed the torch and headed towards the man. I remember sitting by the fire, my heart thudding in my chest as I watched him disappear into the trees. I wanted to call out, to tell him not to go, but the words stuck in my throat. The minutes stretched out, each one heavier than the last. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. But there was no sign of Dad, no voices, no footsteps, nothing. Then the screaming started. It wasn't loud. Not at first, just a faint, muffled sound, like someone shouting from far away. But it grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. It was Dad. I stood up, calling for him, but he didn't answer. The screaming cut off suddenly, leaving the forest deathly still. Something moved in the trees. I spun around, but I couldn't see anything, just shadows shifting in the firelight. Then I heard it. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. I backed away, my chest tight with panic. I didn't know what to do. Stay by the fire? Run? The footsteps came closer, heavy and unhurried, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I had nowhere to go. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the torch and ran, plunging into the darkness. The beam of light bounced wildly, catching glimpses of trees, roots, and nothing else. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on me. Every now and then I thought I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, a rustle of leaves, but when I turned, there was nothing, just shadows. Eventually, I stumbled out onto a dirt path. I followed it blindly, too terrified to think. The woods seemed quieter now, but not in a good way. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, that makes you feel like you're not alone. I don't know how long I ran before I reached the car park where we'd left the car. It was empty, just rows of dark vehicles under the pale glow of a single street lamp. I collapsed against our car, sobbing. The keys still in Dad's jacket back at the camp. He never came back. The police searched for weeks, combing every inch of the forest, but they didn't find him. No body, no footprints, no sign of struggle. Just an empty clearing, a smouldering fire, and a torch lying in the dirt where I'd dropped it. It started as a joke. Well, not quite a joke, but one of those things you say to break the tension when the woods get too quiet. There were 4 of us, all mates from uni, trying to relive the kind of trips we'd taken when we were younger. It was meant to be simple, a weekend away from phones, traffic and fluorescent lights. Just us, a couple of tents and the Peak District sprawling out in every direction. Dan had picked the spot, far off any marked trail, tucked into a clearing surrounded by trees so thick they almost blotted out the sky. We'd set up camp late that afternoon, got a fire going, and cooked up sausages that tasted half of smoke and half of tin. By nightfall, we were all a bit knackered, but the good kind, the kind that comes from being miles away from anything and anyone. Then we found the other campsite. It was John who noticed it first. He'd gone to gather more wood, and when he came back, he had this odd look on his face. He didn't say much, just pointed in the direction he'd come from, and we all followed him. The place was only about 20 minutes from ours, hidden in a little hollow. At first I thought it was just someone else camping nearby, then I saw the state of it. There were 2 tents, both unzipped, the flaps hanging loose like they'd been yanked open in a hurry. A pot of something, stew maybe, was still sitting on a camp stove, the bottom burnt black where the flame had long since gone out. There were clothes scattered everywhere, a pair of boots lying on their sides. A half-eaten loaf of bread was sitting on a plastic table, crusts going green. It didn't look right, not just messy, but wrong, like someone had left in a panic and never come back. The others must have felt it too, because no one said a word. We just stood there, taking it in, the only sound the wind stirring through the trees. Eventually, Dan muttered something about it being none of our business and led the way back to our own camp. We didn't talk much after that, just sat around the fire, poking at the embers and pretending we weren't all thinking the same thing. What could have made someone leave in such a hurry? That night I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made my stomach clench. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. Once I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, but when I held my breath and strained to listen, there was nothing. The next day we tried to act like everything was normal. We hiked, cooked, played cards by the fire, but it wasn't the same. John kept glancing over his shoulder, and Dan was quieter than usual. Even Sarah, who was usually the most laid back of us, kept fidgeting with her watch strap. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get properly strange. I'd woken up in the dark, heart pounding for no reason I could name. The fire outside had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the tent walls. I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just nerves, when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving just beyond the campsite. I told myself it was an animal, a fox maybe, or a badger. But then the sound came again, louder this time and closer. I sat up, straining to see through the thin nylon of the tent. That's when I saw the silhouette. It was just a shape. At first, tall and human-like, standing motionless at the edge of the firelight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to call out to wake the others, but something held me back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring. But eventually the fire died down completely, and the shadow melted into the dark. The next morning, I didn't tell the others what I'd seen. I told myself it was nothing, my imagination playing tricks on me. But when we woke up, we found the campfire ring had been disturbed. The stones shifted into a neat circle. We packed up that afternoon. No one said it outright, but we all agreed to cut the trip short. As we were heading out, we passed by the hollow where the other campsite had been. Only now it was gone. The tents, the stove, the clothes, everything, like it had never been there in the first place. We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. By the time we got back to the car, we were all exhausted. A heavy silence hanging over us. I've thought about it a lot since then, tried to make sense of it. But every time I close my eyes, all I can see is that figure standing at the edge of the firelight. And sometimes late at night, I still feel like I'm being watched. It started with the way she'd flinch. Not at loud noises or sudden movements, but at nothing at all. We'd be working on spreadsheets or answering emails in the office, and her shoulders would jerk like someone had shouted her name. I noticed it more and more after I switched desks and ended up opposite her. Her name was Claire, and she wasn't unfriendly, just quiet, a little cagey, the sort of person who didn't like drawing attention to herself. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it wasn't for her eyes. They were always darting around the room, flicking to the windows, the door, the clock. Even when she was talking to someone, her gaze was restless. It made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I thought she was just shy or stressed, but after a while it became clear it was something else. I'd catch her looking over her shoulder when she thought no one was watching. Once I saw her slip her phone into her bag mid-conversation, her face pale as milk. Whatever it wasn't normal. It's not like we were close, but we worked together enough that I felt comfortable asking if she was okay. I wasn't expecting much. People like Claire don't just open up to anyone. But she looked at me with this strange mix of relief and terror, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask, but dreading it at the same time. She told me she was being followed, not here, at work, but everywhere else. On the way home, at the supermarket, even in her own building. She didn't say much at first, just that it was someone from her past. Someone who wouldn't leave her alone, no matter how many times she changed her number or her locks. I felt sorry for her. It sounded awful living like that, always looking over your shoulder. I told her to go to the police, but she just shook her head. "It won't help," she said. "It'll just make him angrier." That was the first time I really felt afraid. Not for her, but for me, because if someone could scare her that badly, what kind of person were we talking about? I started walking her to the bus stop after work. It seemed like the right thing to do. She never asked, but she didn't say no either. I didn't see anyone following us, though she'd always glance behind us every few steps. Once, I thought I saw a man standing across the road, half hidden by a parked van. But when I looked again, he was gone. After a week or so, Claire seemed calmer. She even smiled once or twice. I thought maybe things were getting better. Then one night, everything changed. We just left the office. It was late, later than usual, and the street was quiet. I remember the sound of our footsteps echoing on the pavement, the way the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows. Claire was walking close to me, clutching her bag like it was a lifeline. I didn't hear him approach. One moment we were alone, and the next, he was there, stepping out of the shadows. He wasn't tall, wasn't muscular, but there was something about the way he stood that made my stomach twist. His face was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes, they were wrong, cold and empty like a doll's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, blocking our path. Claire froze, her breath hitching in her throat. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her across the street. My heart was hammering, but I told myself he wouldn't follow. Not with witnesses nearby. I was wrong. He didn't just follow us, he was relentless. We ducked into a shop, pretending to browse, and he waited outside. When we came out, he was closer, his face unreadable. Every time we turned a corner, he was there, never running, never rushing, just keeping pace, like he had all the time in the world. By the time we reached the bus stop, Claire was shaking so badly I thought she might collapse. She begged me to leave, said she didn't want me involved, but I couldn't just walk away. I stayed until her bus came, watching as she climbed on and disappeared into the night. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. The street was empty again, and the silence felt wrong. I turned to head home, but something stopped me, a sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just started walking, faster and faster, until I was nearly running. The footsteps didn't stop. They stayed with me, keeping perfect rhythm, never speeding up or slowing down. I don't remember how I got home. My hands were trembling so much I could barely unlock the door. Once inside, I locked it behind me and checked every window, every corner, every shadow. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat. By morning, I convinced myself it was over. He wouldn't come after me. He didn't even know me. But now, 3 nights later, I'm not so sure. The feeling hasn't left. The sense of being watched, of someone just out of sight. Last night, I found muddy footprints on the back step. This morning there was a smudge on the window pane, right where someone might press their face against the glass. And just now, as I was locking up for the night, I found something tucked under the doormat. A note. 4 words, scrawled in jagged letters. You should have stayed out. It started with the door. We'd just moved into a snug little terrace on the outskirts of Birmingham. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Or at least ours to rent for the foreseeable. The landlord, a bloke named Mr. Langford, had been kind enough. Middle-aged, balding, with the sort of vague smile that made you wonder if he'd actually been listening to a word you said. He gave us the keys, walked us through the house, and stopped abruptly in front of the basement door. "Don't open it," he said, flat as a plank. No explanation, just that, and then he moved on to explaining how to work the boiler. At first it didn't bother us. The place had charm, sure, but also quirks. Floorboards that creaked no matter how soft you stepped, drafts sneaking in from who knew where, and an odd musty smell that seemed to waft up from beneath the floor. We chalked it up to the house being old. You make do, don't you? But the door, it didn't let us forget it was there. It was tucked at the end of the narrow hallway leading off the kitchen. Painted the same off-white as the rest of the house, it had a black iron latch and a keyhole that seemed to stare back at you. The lock itself looked brand new, gleaming against the worn wood. A week in, the noises began. At first it was just a faint scraping, like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. It happened late at night, when the house was quiet, and you'd start convincing yourself you'd imagined it. But as the nights went on, it got louder. Scrapes turned to thuds, then to what I could have sworn were muffled cries. Sophie, my partner, said it was probably pipes or rats, but rats don't sound like someone sobbing. We tried ignoring it. What else could we do? The landlord's warning sat heavy in my mind. Besides, I'm not one for drama. You hear a weird noise in a new place, you don't immediately start thinking ghosts or murderers. Until the smell started to change. It was sour and damp, like something rotting. I checked everywhere. The fridge, the bins under the sink, nothing, but the stench seemed to grow stronger the closer you got to the basement door. Sophie said we should call Langford, but I hesitated. What would I even say? "Hey, your haunted door smells like death." And then one night something banged against it hard. It jolted us both out of bed. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a cricket bat leaning against the wardrobe, and crept downstairs. Sophie followed close behind, clutching her phone. The door was still shut when we reached it, but the sound came again, a desperate pounding like fists slamming against the other side. My stomach dropped. "Sophie," I whispered, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the door. It couldn't be an animal. Not with that force. I told myself it was stupid, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. The lock wasn't anything fancy. One hard swing with the bat, and it snapped clean off. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow concrete stairs leading down into the dark. The smell hit us like a wall, strong enough to make my eyes water. I reached for the light switch. Nothing. I took a deep breath and descended, Sophie just behind me, her phone torch casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The air was damp and heavy, and every step echoed like a gunshot. At the bottom, the light revealed a small, cramped space. Concrete walls, a dirt floor, and something in the corner. At first I thought it was a pile of rubbish, but then I saw the chains. There were 4 of them bolted into the wall, each attached to a cuff. 3 lay empty, but the 4th, the man was barely alive. Thin as a rake, his skin clinging to his bones, his eyes hollow and terrified. He whimpered as the light hit him, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. His wrists and ankles were raw, the skin rubbed away where the cuffs bit into him. And then I heard it, a creak from the stairs behind us. I turned just in time to see the shadow of a figure at the top of the steps, the door slamming shut, plunging us into darkness. The trip was Danny's idea. He'd been talking about it for months, how we needed to do something real instead of just sitting around at the pub. A proper adventure, he called it, out in the middle of nowhere with no phones or Wi-Fi. We'd laughed at first, but somehow he talked us into it. 3 days in the mountains, a few easy trails, and nights under the stars. It was the 4 of us, Danny, me, Sophie, and Tom. We drove up on Friday morning, parked at a little lay-by by the edge of a forest, and started walking. The first day was fine. The path was wide and easy to follow, winding through trees that opened up every now and then to show us the hills beyond. We set up camp near a stream, cooked some instant noodles on a camp stove, and sat around watching the sky turn pink and gold. The trouble started on the second day. We'd been following a ridge trail, the ground rocky but manageable, when Tom slipped. His foot went out from under him, and he hit the ground hard, his ankle twisted at a sick angle. He couldn't stand, let alone walk. We tried everything, wrapping it up, supporting him between the 3 of us. But it was no good. He was too heavy, and the trail was too rough. Danny said he'd head back to the car for help, while Sophie and I stayed with Tom. It seemed like the best plan at the time. We set up a makeshift camp just off the trail. Sophie and I used our jackets to keep Tom warm, while Danny took most of the food and set off downhill. He said he'd be back by sundown. As the light started to fade, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that presses in on your ears, makes every sound sharper. The wind whistled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance I thought I heard the cry of an animal, high, thin and wavering. Sophie stayed close to Tom, trying to keep him calm. He was pale and sweating, his face twisted with pain. I moved around the edge of the camp, trying to keep busy, gathering firewood, checking the packs, anything to stop myself from sitting still. That's when I saw about 20 feet down the trail, just where the trees started to thicken, there was a figure. A man, I thought at first, standing perfectly still. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but his outline was clear, a tall, broad shape in the growing darkness. I froze, my hand tightening on the stick I'd been holding. He didn't move. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my eyes playing tricks in the fading light, but when I went back to the camp, Sophie noticed I was jumpy. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. The hours dragged on, and the cold started to seep in. Tom was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling under his breath. Sophie and I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and trying to ignore the shadows creeping in from the edges. Then we heard it, a crunch of footsteps on the trail, slow and deliberate. I felt my heart jump, thinking it might be Danny, but the footsteps didn't come closer. They circled instead, moving around the camp just beyond the firelight. Sophie grabbed my arm, her face pale. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again. We waited, every muscle tense, but nothing happened. After a while, Sophie said it must have been an animal. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Animals don't move like that. The night dragged on. Every sound made me flinch. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant call of some bird. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a flash of pale skin between the trees. When dawn finally came, I felt a rush of relief. The sunlight didn't make things better exactly, but at least we could see. Tom was worse, his ankles swollen and his face clammy. Danny still hadn't come back. We decided to leave the camp and head back the way we'd come, carrying Tom between us as best we could. It was slow going, and the trail seemed steeper than I remembered. Around midday, we found Danny's pack. It was lying in the middle of the path, the contents scattered. Food wrappers, his water bottle, his map, no sign of Danny. Sophie called out for him, her voice cracking, but the forest swallowed the sound. I looked up at the ridge above us and thought I saw something move, a shadow shifting against the rocks. We kept going, the air thick with dread. By late afternoon, the trees started to thin and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we were getting close to the car, close to safety. Then, a figure standing on the trail ahead, just where the path dipped into a narrow gorge. It wasn't Danny. It was too tall, too thin, its head cocked at an odd angle. It didn't move. Sophie grabbed my arm and we turned back the way we'd come. Behind us, I heard the sound of footsteps again, steady and unhurried. We didn't stop running until the trail disappeared into the trees.